The next 3 years, I'll be chair of the Bar's committee. Just a word about the City Bar Committee, if you aren't familiar with it. The New York City Bar Association is very active in law reform. Last year, the committee wrote a brief to the U.S. Supreme Court as a friend of the court opposing Arizona's tough immigration law. The committee's often done comments on regulations, puts on CLEs, and in fact, both in the capacity as a City Bar Chair and again as part of New York Law School's project, on Thursday there is a free CLE, continuing legal education event here, open to law students and to lawyers. No charge, 3 credits for skills training. The program is on representing immigrant youth. The CLE is a little bit different design because rather than giving you many lectures on black letter law, you're going to observe scenes from a removal hearing involving an immigrant child and scenes from a family court proceeding. And those of you who've been in either of those settings mean you're in for an exciting evening. No, we have fantastic speakers, some of whom are in the room, and you can register for that event still. There's still space. It's a 3-hour CLE on Thursday. You can find it by going to New York Law School's website and looking for Safe Passage, which is the name of our project. I thought about my introduction today, and I want to be very brief, and I pulled the bios off the web of our really illustrious speakers. But I decided that rather than telling you where they went to school or where they're admitted in the bar, that the more important thing I could say is everyone presenting here tonight is a catalyst for change. They do it in overlapping capacities, and they use every ounce of their talent and their energy and their creativity to raise our awareness in many dimensions of the problems of immigration law policy in the United States. So our 2 commentators tonight, I'll introduce them first, and they're going to speak after our main speaker. Our 2 commentators are Chung-Hwa Hong, who's the executive director of the New York Immigration Coalition. And the coalition, I keep telling my students, is this remarkable nonprofit coordinating body, and I always say of more than 100 organizations providing immigration services. But actually, it's more than 200 organizations, New York statewide. And if they were busy before, they've taken on a yeoman's job of immediately reaching out across the state, trying to help people who are applying for the President's and the Secretary Napolitano's new program called Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. Chung-Hwa is articulate, thoughtful, a mobilizer, a person who brings people together rather than divide them, and I know she'll be an excellent commentator tonight. Next, commentating is Donald Kerwin, who now heads the Center for Migration Studies, which is a 40-year-plus research think tank, educational moving institution that brings together people to talk about so many dimensions of immigration policy, whether it's the intersection with labor law or the rights of children as they covered this summer, or issues of detention. Many of you know Don from his many years of work where he's not only a legal analyst but an empiricist of the first order. He's able to speak truth, to gather facts, and to educate the government, not only the advocacy community. So I know that Don and Chung-Hwa will be excellent commentators. And then the person we're really here to learn from tonight is Professor and author Daniel Kanstrom. Dan is famous for many things. If you read his bio, you're going to say, you know, outstanding professor and taught at many illustrious institutions, including his present institution, Boston College. But what I'd like to highlight to you is that he is one of the rare people in the academic world who not only works at the very highest level of academic scholarship and writing, but also mobilizes and inspires his law school, his students, his community. He partners with the bar. He partners across the world with people to do real change. And his most recent project that is quite stunning, because after he created it, one had to pause and say, why haven't we been doing that? And he has a project for wrongful deportation, or what are the remedies for people who have been removed from the United States? How do you rectify that wrong once the civil process and the order has been executed? What hope is there for those people? So enough introduction, I believe. Dan is going to start first with his PowerPoint presentation and discussion of the new American diaspora. And Dan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be here in what my children refer to as the old country, back to New York. I live in Boston, and I'm really flattered by Lenny's introduction, and to be called a catalyst for change in my business is great. Many times in my profession, the change that we catalyze is mostly rust. So I'm going to try to catalyze something a little different. My parents are here tonight. They, I think, are intrigued to see a PowerPoint presentation. My daughter is here tonight. She, I think, is intrigued to see if I can get some royalties from book sales that will help her as well. It usually takes me about a full year to confuse my students about the subject I'm going to talk to you tonight about. I'm going to try and confuse you in about 40 minutes or so about the subject of deportation. I am going to use a PowerPoint. Hiroshi Matamura, who's a leading immigration scholar, has told me once that power corrupts and PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. But still, I'm going to do my best. I think the first thing when we talk about this subject to bear in mind is that the United States is a nation of immigrants. And this is both an empirical fact and a mythology. And in the sense of it being a mythology, I don't necessarily mean anything negative about it. A mythology is a national understanding of what kind of a country we have. But this one in particular embodies certain dilemmas that are quite fascinating. Certain positive things, certain negative things. I tend to focus more on the negative things, as you'll see. But I don't want to overlook the positive things. Being a nation of immigrants has enormous positive attributes that I think need to be highlighted, cherished, sustained, nurtured. This country takes in over 100 million, actually considerably more than 100 million, non-immigrants each year. People are coming in and out of airports of this country all the time as tourists, as students, as workers. We admit over 1 million people as so-called LPRs, lawful permanent residents, per year. We have a population not only of non-citizens in general, which I'll talk a little bit more about the statistics as we go forward, but of lawful permanent residents specifically, that is very, very high by historical or comparative standards. We have very high naturalization rates. These are all positives. We take in 80,000 plus refugees per year, not enough in my view, but still something, an important accomplishment, and many, many more people come to this country seeking asylum. All of this is very important, but there is another side to the story. And I sometimes use the metaphor for many audiences. I don't think it actually works for this group because you're all pretty sophisticated. But the idea is I don't know who discovered water, but I know that it wasn't a fish. We've been swimming, actually, in the water of deportation for at least 15 to 20 years. I'll give you some more specific timelines as we go. And what strikes me as remarkable about it, and again, I'll give you some numbers, is how little public awareness there is of this massive phenomenon. It is really a huge phenomenon. I sometimes refer to it as a radical social experiment, and I think that is what it is. It's a radical social experiment that is virtually unprecedented, in fact, totally unprecedented historically, and dwarfs almost anything else that has taken place of this type in the history of the world. So it's a radical social experiment by historical measure, by comparative measure, and it's taking place in the nation of immigrants. This is an interesting thing. This is something to ponder, I think. So people are not pondering it. This is I thought this was a very stunning picture. These are the dreamers who lined up in the city of Chicago just, recently. Quite a remarkable thing. This is the population of undocumented young people, and the Obama administration finally, and I will say it was quite belated and less than many of us had hoped for, but finally did something to give people at least some temporary safe harbor, and I think some of the commentators will talk a little bit about this. This is remarkable. I mean, look at these people. You can't but be moved by them, and the idea that they would turn themselves in for removal, an act of incredible courage, if you think about it. People who have been living in that kind of uncertainty their whole lives, turning themselves in, and for what? For a temporary promise not to be deported for 2 years. It'll actually be less than 2 years once the process goes through. That shows you what the pressure is like for the undocumented. And that's a big part of the story, the undocumented, the so-called illegal aliens. This is a big part of our story. You know, terminology matters a lot here, and I spend a lot of time with my students pondering what it means to call people illegal and aliens. I mean, aliens in English obviously has this sort of connotation. There are words in other languages that are better. There are words in English that are better. And the idea of illegality, again, I ask my students to think about this. Illegality is not normally thought of as an existential condition. It's normally thought of as the result of a particular process relating to a particular act. So when you say to people, not what you did was illegal, but you are illegal, that is a very profound condemnation to make of people. It really is an existential epithet. And I challenge my students to come up with other ways of thinking about it. The best one my students have come up with, and we use it at Boston College, is to refer to people as the documentarily challenged. So I'll offer that to you as a possible alternative. Now that is a big part of the story, but it's actually, as little as that is understood and talked about, and there are many aspects of that that I think we'll talk about as we go forward, there's a whole other side to the story that's even less well understood and less talked about. And to illustrate this, I would want to mention an example. As Lenny said, we have a project at Boston College that's called the Post-Deportation Human Rights Project. We get emails, phone calls, letters from all over the world by people who have been wrongly deported. And the numbers will surprise you, I think, as we go forward. It's a large number of people. We got a call, when I first started this project early on, from a young man named Marco, who told us that he had been 5 months old when he came to the United States from Chile. He was brought here as a young man. Grew up in Florida, spent his whole life there. Got a GED, finished high school, was taking some college courses. He had gotten into a little bit of trouble with the criminal law, and by a little bit of trouble, I'm not actually speaking euphemistically. He had one conviction for possession of a very small amount of marijuana and another conviction for possession of 1 tab of LSD. So this young man was about 27, 28 years old, I believe it was, and he decided to take a trip back to Chile to visit his family. And this was a tragic mistake, because when he tried to come back into the United States, he was immediately detained, arrested, transferred to a detention facility in Texas, where he languished for some time trying to figure out what the hell was going on. He actually was able to get a lawyer, but there was nothing. He was what was called an aggravated felon, and he was deported to Chile. He tried to get just some temporary permission just to come back and visit, because he got word after he had been deported, he got word that his mother had died in Florida, and he actually contacted us to say, can you possibly help me come back just to her funeral? And even this we couldn't do. So this is an example of the sort of thing that happens many, many, many times. And it's not new. This was a client that we had, actually, before I even started this project, in 2003, this young woman was named Edna Borges. She was from Cape Verde and came to the United States. You don't have to read the whole article, but I'll just give you the headline. She also came as a very young child, and she found herself in a situation where she had, again, similarly small, minor convictions, shoplifting, that sort of thing. She was showing up, checking in with immigration. One day, everything changed. This was a post-September 11th phenomenon, and suddenly she was arrested on the spot. They said, now, actually, you're an aggravated felon. We're going to arrest you. The thing was that she had her 8-day-old baby with her. And they took the baby out of her arms, and they said, somebody else is going to have to come and pick up this baby. And they put her in what they told her, and it's true, was mandatory detention, and they said, your next hearing date is 15 months away. And that's when she called us. Now, as it turned out in that case, we had some technicalities that we could pull out of our bag of tricks. I was saying to Lenny, one of my favorite, it was actually, I think the lawyer was from New York Law School. It was a New York lawyer I met who had a business card that said, on the card it said, "My fast talking will get you walking." So we were able to get her walking, but actually it doesn't undercut, I think, the strength of the story. And I started thinking about this problem and thinking somebody really needs to start thinking about this more systematically, more holistically. What kind of a system is this? Why does it do things like this to people? And so we started looking into it more, and I started finding that this is quite a pervasive phenomenon. And we find lots of people, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who are legally present in the United States, many of them with green cards. That's permanent legal residents who get caught for minor crimes and then get sent back. Some of the most poignant stories we hear are from Cambodia. From Cambodians. Babies who were brought in their mother's arms fleeing the killing fields as refugees come to this country. They think that they're citizens their whole lives. They grow up thinking they're citizens until they run into somebody in the criminal justice system who contacts somebody in the immigration system, and the next thing they know, there they are with cows in Cambodia surrounded by people who speak a language that they know nothing about, you know, in a country that their families fled. This is a major phenomenon that, as I said, I think is worthy of some study and some thought. Part of what I try to do in my writing and through our project is try to get the voices of the deportees to be heard, because I think people tend to think about these subjects in very abstract and somewhat brittle ways. But when you actually meet people, and again, I suspect most of the people here know what I'm talking about, but for many in the larger public, if it doesn't affect you personally, you don't really understand what is going on out there. And what is going on out there is really quite tragic and quite extraordinary. And once you encounter it, you can't stop being moved by it. At least that's been my experience. It really is in need of serious action. It's not that new. Just to take a step back historically, I happen to find this little quotation from one George Washington, 1783, expressing this very contradiction that I was just telling you about. This is the classic ideal of this country, the nation of immigrants. The bosom of America is open to receive not only the opulent and respectable stranger, but the oppressed and persecuted of all nations and religions, whom we shall welcome to a participation of all our rights and privileges. That phrase, whom we shall welcome, is so resonant. It actually was the title of a presidential commission report in 1951, examining the immigration system as it existed then. These are old ideas, but look at the rest of the quote. Look what he said to the Irish immigrants. If, by decency and propriety of conduct, they appear to merit the enjoyment. So a lawyer reads that and thinks, well, that's interesting, but who gets to decide what's decent? Who makes the decision about what is propriety of conduct? These are legal questions. This is where the law runs into morality and ethics and justice. And it has been a deep tension in this country from the beginning. Deportation is the fulcrum upon which that tension works. It's the mechanism for implementing that tension. And that's why I think it's important, not only for the deportees, but it actually is integral to the idea of what is this nation of immigrants? What is this thing that we're working on? I think it's that important. Deportation itself is pretty easy to define. It's the expulsion of non-citizens by a state through the actual or threatened use of force. There are various other ways to define it, but that's what it boils down to. I spent a lot of time asking, how should we theorize this? How could one think about it? And I don't have time today to go through all these things with you. These are various ways that people think about deportation. Some say we need deportation because we need border control. Other people say we need deportation because we want to regulate the composition of the population. Other people say it's part of labor market regulation. In fact, deportation is part of labor market regulation, although it's ironic because it actually does it as a sort of effect, not as intentionally. A lot of people talk about the form of deportation that I was just talking about as part of crime control. And others say it's the rule of law. Look, they say, these people broke the law, period. That's the end of it. I write in the book, and I try to repeat to people a lot and say to my students, saying that somebody broke the law is not a sentence that should be followed by a period. It's a sentence that should be followed by a question mark. They broke the law. Yes, laws have been broken. But what are we supposed to do about that? What is the appropriate sanction for breaking a particular type of law? You can't just say they broke the law, therefore all bets are off, therefore they are illegal people with no rights. Or even after they've been deported to say they are illegal people outside of the United States with no rights. I think that's wrong too. I should say I also teach human rights law, so for most Americans this may seem like a quaint idea that there are rights out there, but there actually are, I think. Anyway, in a previous book, I tried to distinguish these two forms of deportation and say one is what I call extended border control and the other is post-entry social control. The extended border control model of deportation relates to the border. And it has its own issues with it, but I'm just suggesting these are two ways of thinking about the subject. So when you think about the documentarily challenged, we're talking about extended border control removal. These are people who are undocumented, and it's a question. What should we do about it? The post-entry social control is a more complicated set of questions because those people are otherwise here legally. They have committed some sort of crimes, or maybe they've donated money to the wrong charity, or they were members of the wrong religious or ethnic group. People get deported for all kinds of things, which I can tell you more about. That's a more complicated question. Why do we deport people like that? So this, too, is not a new question. Thomas Jefferson dealt with a law that had been passed in 1798 that authorized the president at the time, John Adams, I'm sure you all remember him. He was authorized to say, whoever he deems to be dangerous to the United States, the president could individually order that person to be deported. So a lot of people thought, I think there's something wrong with this, but I can't quite put my finger on what it is, which is sort of what motivates me most of the time. And Jefferson said, the friendless alien has been selected as the safest subject of a first experiment, but the citizen will soon follow. So you see this in public discourse a lot. A lot of immigrants' rights organizations say, well, whatever you do to them, don't do it to them, because then pretty soon they'll start doing it to us. Personally, I don't find that the most convincing argument, because it prompts a sort of rejoinder, which is, what if we really promise never to do it to you? Well, I'm still saying I don't think you should do it to them anyway, so you need a different kind of theory. And that theory, I think, was articulated by James Madison, who said, even if aliens are not parties to the Constitution, it does not follow that the government has an absolute power over them. This is a sort of basic constitutional rights, human rights sort of argument, and I think that's more my starting point. These are people. They have certain fundamental rights. We have to ask hard questions about the sanctions. Do you think that it's appropriate that somebody should be permanently banished from the country they grew up in because they possessed a small amount of marijuana and 1 tab of LSD? That's the question. And if you think the answer to that question is no, then you have to think harder about why. You know, what is it that I think about law? I know Don is going to talk about the rule of law, and I respect his work greatly. I should say that Don is smarter than I am. I've just been waiting publicly to say it, and now is my opportunity. So I have 4 polemical assertions about this that motivate my own work. First of all, deportation should be understood as an enforcement mechanism. It's about more than immigration status. For the academics in the room, you might hear a little Foucault in this. I'm studying it as a system of power. It's about more than immigration. It is about something else. It is also highly anomalous. I'll tell you more about that in a minute, and much larger than most people think. Obviously, it challenges societal values and basic human rights, and it has created a new American diaspora. Now, this is the title of my book, so it needs a little bit of defense. I mean, some writers in the field have said we should stop using this word diaspora. There's one article about this that talks about a diaspora, because everybody wants to be a diaspora. You've got Jews, Armenians, there's a Dixie diaspora, there's gay and lesbian diasporas. Everybody wants to say diaspora. So I thought long and hard, should I use the word diaspora? And as you can tell from the cover of the book, which my daughter, again, wants you to buy copies of so she can get royalties, my answer was yes, it is a diaspora. Why is this? I'll just cut to the last version, the last point. We have a forcibly uprooted population of people with deep, cohesive social and cultural connections to each other and to the nation state from which they have been involuntarily removed. I would suggest to you that that is a pretty defensible working definition of diaspora. Not uncomplicated, because some of these people, you know, obviously they were not necessarily invited to stay here as citizens in the first place, so it's complicated. We can talk more about it, but I think I can defend the use of the term. And the fact is, around the world, This is a large population. I meet them all over now. You go to the Azores, you want to talk about the Boston Red Sox? Don't talk about the Boston Red Sox. It's too depressing for words. But I can find guys in the Azores who know more about the Boston Red Sox than I run into on the streets of Cambridge, because these guys all grew up in Boston, and they can tell you who Teddy Ballgame was. They remember the Red Sox. But they're in the Azores. They've been deported. Anyway, it's a diaspora. So, just a little bit of a tutorial. Anyone who is not a U.S. citizen faces deportation. That could be the undocumented, documentarily challenged, asylum seekers, non-immigrants, anybody. So this system hangs like the cliche-ridden sword of Damocles over that entire population. Now, let me give you some other statistics. Here's a sort of interesting take on the Washington thing and on the Nation of Immigrants thing. The foreign-born population of the United States, actually this chart is a little out of date. If we continued for 3 more years, you would find, as has been reported in the New York Times and elsewhere, actually is now at as high a level as it has ever been in the United States. So the percentage of people who were born elsewhere are as high now. I think the previous height was 1910. That's an important thing, again, to bear in mind when we ask ourselves, what is really going on here? What is going on in this country? Because the other thing that's happening is we have to ask, how big is the deportation system? So this is an empirical question, but it actually requires you to think hard about how are you going to measure it? What would you use to measure it? One way to measure it is this, to say what is the size of the population over whom deportation rules? And this is about 38 million foreign-born people, about 21 million in legal immigration status, about 160 million new immigrants, about 1 million legal immigrants coming in, and 11 to 12 million documentarily challenged. That's a big population to begin with. They are all potentially subject to deportation. That's one way to measure it. I don't actually think it's the most gripping way to measure it. So here's another way. I started teaching immigration law about 3 weeks ago to my students at Boston College, and I say to them, how many people do you think get deported from the United States each year? Now, I know some people have read the book, so you know the answer, but if I were to poll this room, I would guess, based on my students, that you would say, well, he said it's a big system, so my guess is it could be 20,000 per year, 30,000, 40,000, something like that, some big number, right? Well, here's a number. Since 1980, the number of times that an individual has been caught somewhere on U.S. soil and determined to be subject to removal has exceeded 35 million events. 35 million times government agents have met somebody and said, you got to go. Now that, I say, I have to be clear, includes what they call returns and removals. A lot of that are people at the border. I think it was my brother who pointed out to me that it could have been one Mexican guy who was deported 34,999,000 times and somebody else. So we don't know exactly how many people, but it's still a pretty big number by virtually any measure. And this has been pretty consistent since about 1996, which is when there was a watershed change in the deportation laws that changed the harshness of the laws, that took away a lot of the discretion of immigration judges and so forth. These are the latest numbers for this year. We've had about 640,000 apprehensions. So it's been running about 1 million per year. Although what's interesting is that we are now seeing fewer of the returns, the close to the border actions, and more of the removals. So this administration, as part of its policy of what it calls smart enforcement, has been focusing more on the post-entry social control deportations than on the undocumented. They've stopped the factory raids, which were a stain on the Bush administration, but the focus is now more on this. And we've got 188,000 known criminal aliens removed just last year. Now, if I were running for public office and you were advising me, you would probably say, championing the rights of people who are called known criminal aliens is probably not a good strategy for, success in any endeavor in life. But who are these known criminal aliens? 66% drugs, most typically possession, traffic offenses, and immigration-related violations. So the criminal alien sounds pretty harsh, and some of them are pretty bad actors, but most of them aren't. And that, I think, is another important fact to bear in mind. So we want to ask questions about this, and one of the questions I ask is, does it work? How do people justify this form of deportation? Well, let's say that you were to justify it as border control. Sorry, I'm going to skim over some of these numbers, although actually, note, I'll go back just to show you the rising tide in the last few years. And particularly the yellow on the bottom shows the number of removals and how big it's been. But look at these numbers, you know, since the 90s. It's a huge system. I don't want to overstay my time here too much, so I won't dwell on the details. Has it worked as border control? Well, this is very hard to measure because, of course, you could say, well, if they hadn't deported all those people, we'd have even more undocumented people, and I suppose you could make that claim. Although I have to say we've done a lot of empirical work in Guatemala. I particularly went to Guatemala 3 years ago, and we were interviewing a lot of people, and many, many people are undeterred by deportation. They're willing to risk rape, death in the desert in order to come here, and the risk of deportation is just another thing that gets factored into the calculus. And the fact is that if you try to measure the population over time, we see that there really hasn't been much of a decrease. In fact, there's been an increase. So this massive deportation experiment does not seem to have worked if its goal was to control the border. Spending, on the other hand, has gone way up. These are in billions. We're up around 16 or more billion on this subject. The phrase, they have more money than God, is something that I hear a lot about. I think ICE agents have a lot of trouble figuring out how can we spend all this money that we have, because they keep coming up with new ideas. So what about crime? Well, that's the other possible thing. And we know that a lot of people, as I said, have been deported. In a 10-year period, we have about 1.2 million people who were deported for this post-entry criminal conduct. What kind of people were they? Well, I told you. The vast majority were for a nonviolent offense. This is pictures of some of the deportees. Anyway, the vast majority are deported for relatively minor drug offenses. Is it working to control crime rates? Well, again, you have a difficult empirical problem here in measuring it, but there is pretty good research. Sociologists have been starting to look at this with some seriousness. Ruben Rimbaud is one of the leaders of this, and he used a phrase, the paradox of assimilation. What he and others have discovered is a number of things, but that the predictors of criminality are length of residence in the United States and U.S. citizenship status. Actually, male gender is the single best predictor of criminality, but I don't like to highlight that fact for obvious reasons. Anyway, they said if there was an immigrant crime problem, it was not found among the immigrants, but among their U.S.-born sons. So if that's the case, how is deportation the solution to that sort of crime problem, I ask you? I'll just leave that question hanging out there. Now, I could give you a little bit of a history lecture about why it's anomalous, but I'm going to skip that over, only to say that the Supreme Court made certain decisions in the late 19th century vis-a-vis some shockingly racist cases that were called the Chinese exclusion laws. And these are the foundational cases upon which our system is based. And the consequences of those decisions that we live with today, the constitutional doctrines, are that deportation is civil. It's not criminal. That's very important because deportees don't have the rights of criminal defendants. It's not punishment. Those are the two most important things. I'll skip over the system, but I do want to tell you that the consequence of this is that you can face mandatory detention as a deportee. If the government charges you with being deportable, many, many of these people will have no possible right to bail ever. For however long the process lasts, they'll never get out. And criminal lawyers will tell you that bail is absolutely essential to preparing a defense. So the likelihood of winning a deportation case goes down dramatically as a result of incarceration. And I glossed over it with the statistics, but we're up around 430,000 detentions now per year by ICE. That system is growing too. It's all over the country. So mandatory detention, no right to counsel. If you cannot afford a lawyer as a deportee, you will not get one. Why is that? Because Gideon versus Wainwright doesn't apply, because it's not criminal, it's not punishment, no right to counsel. There's very good data about the difference in success rates between people who have lawyers versus those who don't. You do much, much better if you have a lawyer, but many people here don't have one. The Supreme Court decided in 2010 in a case called Padilla versus Kentucky, that the two systems were converging sufficiently that there should be certain rights for deportees who have criminal lawyers. The criminal lawyers ought to at least know something about immigration and deportation. That was an important decision. How it's going to play out is still being sorted through. But the fact remains that in the deportation proceeding itself, you do not have a right to counsel. Deportees have minimal, if any, Fourth Amendment rights. The case was from 1984. It was called INS versus Lopez Mendoza. And the court said it's not like a criminal trial. If the government seizes evidence illegally from your nightstand, they break into the house, they find your passport, and they want to use that against you. If they wanted to use that against you in a misdemeanor marijuana prosecution, they could not do it. That's the Fourth Amendment. It's an unreasonable search or seizure. But in deportation proceedings, they can do it unless a lawyer, which again, most people don't have the right to have one of, can convince an immigration judge that it's either egregious or part of a widespread practice, which is possible to prove, but hard, and you need to be a good lawyer to do that. So that's another thing. And deportation can be retroactive. Now, bear with me on this because I say this a lot and people think I must be making it up, so I'm just going to say it slowly. Actually, I wasn't planning to say it that slowly, but I was thinking I wanted to phrase it a little differently. So a person can be deported for doing something that was not a deportable offense when they did it. So let's say you want to donate money to a political organization and you go to your immigration lawyer and you say, you know, I have a green card, but I'm a little worried, you know, can I give money to this group? And the lawyer looks it up and says, no, yeah, they're fine, they're not on any list. 20 years later, the Congress can pass a law that says anybody who once donated money to this organization is now deportable. Or let's say you want to plead guilty to possession of marijuana, let's say, because the lawyer says it's not a big deal, you're in a state where you're going to get probation, nothing's going to happen. And then 10 years later, the Congress says anybody who once pled guilty to marijuana is now subject to deportation because of that. They can do it. Deportation is civil and it can be retroactive. And there's more. You have minimal selective prosecution rights. So the government can select people for deportation for all kinds of reasons, political affiliation, etc. So all of this adds up to the fact that prosecutors love deportation. It's a very powerful tool. In the aftermath of September 11th, which is appropriate to mention given the date, the whole system, the incredible advantages of using deportation became apparent. And many people felt the wrath of the system as it rose. But that was not the watershed moment. As I said, it was really the 1996 laws that were the big change here. No jury trial, restrictive administrative and judicial review, and this is the thing that has been motivating me recently. Let's say you get deported and you discover that you were deported by mistake. And let's say that you find out about my project and you want to write me a letter from Honduras and saying, they got the wrong guy, or I've now seen the record and the Supreme Court said I wasn't an aggravated felon. Actually, possession of marijuana and LSD is not an aggravated felony. I want to file a motion to reopen. I want to get back into court and say, you were wrong, I should never have been deported in the first place. The rule of the Board of Immigration Appeals, which we're challenging all over the country and winning some of these cases, but the rule is you cannot do that. The rule is once you are out, you are out. The government gets to deport its mistakes, and you cannot reopen those cases. That really sticks in my craw, I have to say, and I've been dedicating myself to overturning that, and I welcome any help. I'm going to skip over a couple of these things again. I thought I would show you some pictures of removals in case you don't appreciate it. I know, again, a lot of the people in this room really do know this, so I apologize. But these were pictures of the SWIFT raids in the Bush administration. I just show them to highlight you kind of have to experience one of these to appreciate the militaristic aspect of it, the incredible assertion of government power that takes place during these raids. In raids in Massachusetts, we saw dozens, actually hundreds, of people who were arrested. Mothers had their children in daycare. They said to the arresting officers, I have a child in daycare. The officer said, I don't care, that's not my problem. Somebody had to call state social workers to come in and intercede with the feds. They now have some practices and policies in place to try to make that not happen. But this was part of what I refer to as the new deportation delirium. This was the one in Postville, Iowa, which received a fair amount of press coverage. And I see Luis Argueto here. There's a wonderful film about this, which I give a shout out to, called Abused, A-B-U-S-E-D, about that raid and its aftermath. Really worth seeing. But, I mean, just look at the size of this and the effects on families. So what are the effects of deportation? Here are some things we know. Over 100,000 parents of U.S. citizen children were deported in the 10-year period between 1997 and 2007. So given how difficult it is to measure the positive effects of this system, it turns out to be rather easy to measure the negative consequences of this system. It has had devastating effects. We are doing research now from Boston College on children and families in New England. We can measure these things. We can measure issues that take place in schools. We can measure anxiety, sleeplessness, all kinds of things, including just the qualitative research of talking to people and saying, what is it like to grow up without dad or to have no relationship with your parents? So at least 100,000, and really probably more than those, more than that number. We know the effects now. And it's not only the children whose parents are deported, but it's also U.S. citizen children who get deported along with their parents and then grow up in Guatemala, even though they are U.S. citizens. And of course, that's only one way to capture it. I don't want to suggest that the fact that a U.S. citizen is involved makes the harm any more palpable or poignant. I'm just giving this as an example, because deportation has separated hundreds of thousands of families, millions really. And there are a lot of elderly parents, particularly in the Cambodian community, who are growing up with nobody to care for them because their sons have been deported. So, it's a stunning set of issues the more you look into it. So I'll come back to the final question here, how to think about this. This is Louis Post. I think he was kind of a hero of Lenny Benson, and he was the Commissioner of Immigration during a time that he referred to as the deportations delirium of 1920, which was when the young J. Edgar Hoover got his start as a deportation agent. Not everybody realizes that's where Hoover started. And he deported anarchists and people like Emma Goldman and so forth. So he wrote this book, and that was in a period in which deportations totaled 14,557. That was the deportations delirium. At that same time, immigrant admissions to this country totaled 430,000. So we had a ratio. And again, come back to George Washington. I'm saying, how do we calibrate the nation of immigrants, the incoming and the outgoing? 3 to 100. 3 deportations per 100 entrants. What do we have now? Since 1996, we've admitted 14.3 million lawful permanent residents. I would say that's good. That's a big number. That's a lot of people. How many have we deported? 20.7 million during that same period. What's the ratio? 144 to 100. So I ask you, if it was a delirium then, what is it now? So we started this project, the Post-Deportation Human Rights Project. Originally I called it the Ruby Slippers Project. Here's a cautionary tale about human rights branding. We went into the Cambodian community and said it's the Ruby Slippers Project. They translated that into Khmer. That translated as the Red Shoes Project. The Cambodians thought we were communists, and they didn't want to talk to us. So my staff said we better come up with another name. They didn't come up with anything as engaging as Ruby Slippers, so now it's the Post-Deportation Human Rights Project. And this is what we try to do, is to conceptualize a new area of law to represent individuals who have been deported, etc. Lenny talked about that, and we can talk more about it in the questions. U.S. citizens, by the way, get deported in non-trivial numbers. That's another piece of it that I won't get into now, but we have a lot of reports of that happening. Lots of deportees who were deported incorrectly. We estimate that it's probably tens of thousands of people who, looking back on it, should not have been deported because the government theory was aggressive. And the Supreme Court has rejected these government theories in case after case, and not by close margins. The conservative court rejects these theories 8-1, 9-0, says the government theory makes no sense. But meanwhile, 10,000 people were deported pursuant to that theory. What happens to those people? Answer, they're sitting in Honduras and the Azores and everywhere else, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, reading about this and then writing us letters saying, can you help? That's part of the problem. All right, I'll skip over this. It is a new diaspora, and they're all over the world. And the last piece of this is the deportees are horribly mistreated in a lot of the world. They're stigmatized, they're isolated, they're totally deracinated, they have been severed from their roots, they have no social support networks, they have no families. What happens to them? It's really a human rights tragedy, and as I said at the beginning, I think it's been going largely under the radar. People don't realize what's going on out there. I'll leave you with a final thought from Justice Murphy, that what we are doing is trying to zealously guard the rights of the most humble, the most unorthodox, and the most despised among us. And we don't only do it for them, we do it for us. We do it to be the country that we want to be. Thank you.
Well, it's a big step up. So just to give you an idea of how we're going to run this part of the program, the two commentators, first we're going to hear from Don Kerwin, and then from Chung-Hwa Hong. Then we'll have some time for Q&A, but I was remiss in my introduction to thank James O'Malley, who's sitting here in the front row. James has a law firm, O'Malley & Associates, and I called him and I asked him if he would help underwrite some of the reception part of this event, because we're doing this without a budget. So thank you, New York Law School, for giving us space. Thank you, James O'Malley, for giving us some sustenance. And it isn't that James just gave us some food and wine. He also is an outstanding immigration attorney who has often helped people in need. So thank you. Okay, Don, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm going to disprove what Dan said about me being so intelligent. Certainly, I'm not more intelligent than he is. And I'm going to be particularly cautious. I once did a book review at an event like this, and kind of didn't like the book as much as I liked Aftermath and spoke negatively about it, only to have the mother of the author actually come up to me afterwards and scold me. So I'm going to be Dan's got an army here. I'm going to be careful. So I'm very happy to be here this evening and to kind of lift up these issues and to celebrate the work of my friend and colleague and partner in crime over many years, Dan Canstrom. For those who care about immigrant rights or those who care about the rule of law or sovereignty, we live in very challenging times because these concepts have been hijacked and they've been distorted beyond all recognition. Immigrant rights has been mischaracterized as benefits that undeserving people get to the detriment of others. We know the politicians and the pundits and the otherwise misinformed people who argue that rights turn on immigration status, which of course is a relatively superficial part of human identity, not on personhood or on membership in the human family. And yet in the Constitution, rights apply to persons. They don't apply to citizens. And for those law students who out there, human rights apply to human beings. That's right. That's Human Rights Law 001, right? So I think that, there's a real problem with how people think about rights. And the rule of law, of course, has been conflated with this notion of law and order, or rule by law, or rule under authority of law. And many kind of support zero-tolerance enforcement of ever harsher laws, whatever their merits, without a concern for whether they honor rights or have any kind of procedural protections. That's not what the rule of law means. That's not what the rule of law has ever meant, for that matter. And then finally, this notion of sovereignty is often treated as an expression of absolute state power to defend borders, basically to self-determine, to determine membership in a particular country, and to enforce the law as the executive sees fit, divorced from any kind of positive responsibility to protect rights and to further the common good. It's almost as if the whole World War II era of international law development hasn't happened. Sovereignty is not an absolute right. It's not really a right at all, actually. And Aftermath argues quite persuasively, I think, that this authority, the sovereign authority, which it doesn't shortchange, it's important, but it has to be balanced with the rights of actual human beings. And indeed, sovereign states actually exist to defend rights. So in some cases, it's not a matter of balance at all. It's a matter of the sovereign doing what they're supposed to be doing. I think the misuse of this term is part of a larger political tactic to criminalize immigration violations. Dan spoke a little bit about that. To scapegoat, to blame immigrants for whatever happens to be the social problem that's getting the most attention at that time, whether it's terrorism or the housing crisis or the health care crisis or the Great Recession or high native unemployment or even leprosy, for God's sakes. The immigrants have brought leprosy back to the United States. And really, this other tactic of ascribing to immigrants, particularly unauthorized immigrants, the more high-profile crimes of any unauthorized immigrant or of any immigrants. You know, if a crime's committed by an immigrant, it's because they're an immigrant. And of course, that's silly, but it actually is quite potent politically. The public, I think, often doesn't care about these issues or doesn't seem to care. It's like, you know, that old joke, what's worse, apathy or ignorance, you know, and the answer is, I don't know and I don't care, right? And that often seems to be the public's response. I think Dan's scholarship and his advocacy positions and his activism, and Dan is this special guy that is a great scholar and a great activist and a great direct service provider and a litigator and all of these things. But all this work kind of puts him beyond the pale. And if his views gain a modicum of acceptance, he kind of referred to this, well, then he's going to be forced to write something that again puts him outside the mainstream, right? Which is where he seems to be comfortable. So it's not a big surprise that he wrote about people that are outside the mainstream or beyond the pale. I'd like his arguments and aftermath to, in fact, be mainstreamed. This word pale is an interesting one to me because I think it has two meanings, and it goes to what he talks about. In a physical sense, it means to be enclosed by a boundary or a line that you can actually see in a map. That's a pale. But it also means a place that one author has defined as having unfixed and movable borders that both identify and that separate different cultures. So in this sense, you can live physically within the pale, but be outside and be beyond it because you're living under an entirely separate set of codes and rules. Aftermath is about a community of people who Dan, you know, provocatively calls, as he says, the New American Diaspora, who are bound by the experience of living in the United States, but have been exiled from their adopted home. Many have been deported from U.S. family. Many were lawful permanent residents here. Many were deported from people that supported them, but also the people that they supported. And that was kind of a story that's told in this book that I hadn't focused on so much. Deported from the only communities that they ever knew. Some for minor crimes that they committed years in the past, some for crimes that didn't make them deportable at the time, and some wrongfully deported. As he said, they constitute the equivalent of a medium-sized nation, and they're spread throughout all four corners of the world. But Aftermath is also about the immigrants who live in the United States but are outside the pale because our immigration system puts them there. They live under a separate set of rules. Early in the book, Dan raises this rhetorical question that we hear an awful lot in the immigration debate. That is, what don't you get about the illegal and illegal alien? That's supposed to be the showstopper. And the short answer for me is I don't get the illegal and I don't get the alien. You know, illegal is an adjective. It's not a permanent condition, right? It's not a noun. You don't become permanently illegal because you've done something to break the law. I often speak to faith-based groups, and when I'm asked that question, I say, you know, what don't you get about God-given human dignity? You know, is it the God? Is it the human? Is it the dignity? What exactly is it? Dan argues, I think, he makes less emotional arguments. He argues for a richer, more nuanced view of the rule of law. He asks, how does it further the rule of law, in fact, to divide and to destroy families, to undermine the right to family unity, which is widely recognized in international law, this right which seems to matter to so many in this country, except when it comes to immigrants, right? How does it further the rule of law to curtail judicial review, which is fundamental to our system of separation of powers, judicial review? How does it further the rule of law to allow fast-track, expedited removal of persons who are caught at the border, some of whom face immense danger at home? How does it further the rule of law to create a deconstitutionalized zone that covers entire border communities, millions of people, where searches and infringements on liberty that would be unthinkable in the rest of the country are actually commonplace? Or to deny core rights to people, to housing, to work, effectively to police protection, to utilities, to public education, and even, you know, the push to deny citizenship to people born here. is a means to an end. And attrition by enforcement is, I might say, that strategy is part of the Republican platform as we speak. To create a system with little discretion and where punishment is often wholly out of proportion to the offense. A system in which, through a variety of mechanisms, more than half of the people deported never see the inside of a court. Never. And where half of those in removal proceedings lack legal counsel, although representation is often more crucial in terms of prevailing in a claim than the strength of the underlying claim, and that's a fact and it's proven. A system that, and Dan talks about this quite poignantly, that deports and detains mentally ill people without counsel who have never even had a competency hearing. A system that prevents persons who have been deported under legal interpretations that are later repudiated in the courts from ever returning to the United States. We live in an era of globalization, but once people are deported, our legal system operates as if, and Dan uses the phrase, there's kind of a territorial on-off switch. Once they're gone, they're beyond the law, they're beyond the pale. Aftermath argues very persuasively, as well as anything that I've read, that the rule of law is about these issues as well. Complicating matters, these laws are now enforced by a Homeland Security, National Security Agency, and the instinct in these agencies is not transparency, it's not about sharing information with the public, but the trend is to let the public relations people kind of handle the inquiries. We used to criticize the Immigration Service quite a bit, it was a backwater agency, but the fact was that it was more responsive than the Department of Homeland Security with its $16 billion budget. A lot of us were in the backwater with that agency, and they were there with us. And of course, as Dan points out, the national security agencies also excel at euphemism. What do you call enforcement of immigration laws? Enforcement that effectively limits police protection to immigrant communities and that emboldens criminals. What do you call that local enforcement of immigration laws? Well, of course you call it force multiplication, right? I mean, one euphemism after the next. I'm not going to speak at length. I just wanted to commend this book to you. I think it's the best treatment I've seen of these issues. I think these issues are crucially important, and it's by a scholar and an activist and an advocate who's really at the top of his game and is doing something very, very exciting. What he's doing is he's extending the rule of law where it hasn't been to those people beyond the pale, both here and abroad. And if you can help him in any way, I guess first by buying the book, but second kind of joining this push, this new area of law that he's trying to create, I'd highly recommend that you do so. Thank you.
Great. I'm also really honored to be here and to be responding to such a great presentation. Those of us, who are doing kind of the day-to-day work don't even get to sit down and read books, and so PowerPoint, even though it corrupts, does have its merits. So I really want to appreciate kind of organizing all the contents into that presentation, and now I'm really motivated to buy the book and really delve into it. So thank you so much. I wanted to just point out a few things that resonated with me, and also to link it to actual campaigns that are happening on the local level, because when the problem is this severe, there's always a lot of things you can do about it, and we would love to just recruit more volunteers and have more people get involved. I think immigration is one of the most complex issues, and so it's not like, well, here's a problem and here's a solution and here's the campaign. There's probably like 50 different campaigns going on right now to try to crack this problem that we have and that affect so many immigrant communities. I do want to mention what a big deal the deferred action for childhood arrivals is, given what's happening, because I think it is the one thing that's happened during the current administration that could signal a directional change for where the policy could go. In addition to the huge number of people that it could affect, national estimates show, up to 1.7 million Dreamers could be eligible for relief under Deferred Action Program. So that's a pretty big program. And it's an affirmative benefit that you can apply for, which is a stark departure from anything that we've seen. So it's very ironic that deferred action is happening at the same time as, the highest levels of deportations, which is, almost 400,000 people a year that we've seen in the the current presidency. And so those of us working on deferred action feel that this is an opportunity that we have to really show, if given the tools, if given the legal access to, work permit and to some of the basic, what we call integration opportunities, that this is a great opportunity to show the rest of America what Dreamers can contribute to our nation and our society. And I think that's one of the things that we have to do is not fighting the legality framework with the legality framework, but really highlighting what we call immigrant integration. And I think this is really directly connected to the diaspora idea, because I think all of the problems of deportation and demonizing immigrants arise from not accepting immigrants as part of our society, not accepting immigrants as part of the integrated whole of who we are. And so that's why another big turnaround moment in the immigrant rights movement was back in 2006 and 2007, when millions of immigrants came out into the streets and said, they didn't just say immigrant rights, I have a right. They said, we are America. So that was an existential statement, kind of asserting who we are. So I think one of the things that we want to do, together with kind of political campaigns, which are absolutely necessary to mobilize our communities for big rallies and voter registrations and, issue-based campaigns, that we really need to lift up this, identity issue. One of the reasons why we have deferred action is because local organizations and Dreamers fought for it. In the beginning, the White House said, no way, we're not going to do anything categorical. They categorically rejected any sort of relief for any category of people when we had pushed for Dreamer relief. And that's why their first attempt of responding to the deportation crisis was prosecutorial discretion. We'll do a case-by-case review of prosecutorial discretion. That's the other trend that's worth noting, because prosecutorial discretion has declined so severely over the last 10 years. If you look at the, out of all the detained cases, and we know that there's almost 400,000 detentions per year, only 1% of the detained cases were found to be eligible for prosecutorial discretion. And so what we see is there's a local Supreme Court judge, Judge Katzman, that some of you might know, is telling us that 10 years ago, only 4% of his cases were immigration cases. Now it's 40%, because none of the immigration judges are exercising prosecutorial discretion. All the cases are going up to the Supreme Court. Sorry.
It's a metaphor. It gets stuck in his throat saying these bad things.
I know. I have the hardest time saying the word prosecutorial discretion. Deferred action for childhood arrival. So anyway, so if anybody wants to help to get the most out of deferred action, we would welcome just more partners. And it's important to note that deferred action isn't just for college students. That's what most people think. There's actually about 350,000 Dreamers who are, out of school. and they don't have GEDs, they're not in college, they're not in high school. Many of them call our offices and say, you know, I had to drop out because what was the point of going to high school if you can't, you know, if you can't make use of the degree to go to college? And what's the point of going to college when I can't get a job afterwards? And so a lot of immigrants who are already marginalized have also are most likely to not make it into the deferred action program. And so we need to do advocacy so that the resources are there, invested in GED programs and vocational programs, which deferred action applicants can take advantage of. Because we were very fortunate to have some of the regulations define the in-school definition so that you don't have to be a college student. You could sign up for some of these other programs. Anyway, I want to mention a couple of things about health and education because you know, traditionally we've distinguished immigration issues from integration issues. Immigration is about how many people come in, you know, under what criteria. Integration is how we treat people once they're here. But I think the more we can succeed in integrating immigrants here, the less we can make immigrants vulnerable to unfair attacks. But that's not looking too well because health and education we see as two big pillars of integration. And education, as you know, immigrants are in many cases barred from getting financial aid to go to college, treated completely differently. In healthcare, and also if you look at the dropout rates, if you look at, you know, in New York, Mexican students as one ethnic group, almost 60% don't graduate high school within 4 years. So we have a major kind of a dropout crisis in our education system, even when undocumented students are have full rights to attend public school systems. So it's not just an immigration status issue, it's about how integrated can you get into the education and healthcare kind of systems. Healthcare, even if you're a legal immigrant paying into the Medicaid system, if you get hit by a bus, you cannot get Medicaid benefits for the first 5 years of your legal residency. Fortunately, in New York State, we have a state level policy that makes up for that. So you do have state Medicaid that you are eligible for. But during the healthcare discussion, our Congress made sure that LPRs continued to not have access to Medicaid. And if you're undocumented, you're excluded from the exchange, which means you can't even pay full price to buy private insurance with your own money if you're undocumented. So that's something on the state level we're also trying to change. So along with deportation, I think there's a lot of opportunities to help immigrants who are struggling to, even without the status, trying to integrate themselves into various parts of our society and to make the contributions that they can. So we have current campaigns and advocacy going on in health, education, you know, financial, accessing financial resources and so on, along with, you know, trying to build the foundations toward a more permanent solution for immigrants, toward legalization and toward fixing 96, what we call Fix 96, because even legalization is not going to help everyone because so many legal LPRs are subject to lack of due process and deportation. So all of those things were very resonating, and I think it's one of the best ways of kind of summarizing what's wrong with our current immigration system. So I'd like to just thank the Professor Canstrom for writing your book, and we will try to get it out to as many people as possible. And if you send me your PowerPoint, I will send it out to people who might not have time to read the entire book. Thank you.
Thank you. It occurs to me my next challenge will be to overturn copyright law. So Letty asked me to take questions and to do this job. Please frame your question in the form of a question. And the one question, who do you think you are, is not a possible question that I'm going to entertain, or WTF is not a question to entertain here. Restate the question. Sir.
Would you suggest, as I've heard in some quarters, Letty mentioned, doing away with the deportation system, or as in criminal law, trying to do sort of graded penalties? Or should we just end the idea of second-class personhood in the United States?
Okay, so the question was, do I personally or the panel support eliminating deportation entirely or think about other models? And one of the really great things about being in this field is that there are some great scholars on all sides of that. There's a very strong group of people who I would generally call the cosmopolitans, who would argue against the nation state entirely and argue that why should the accident of the place where you were born, they say it's almost feudalism to think that you should get these incredible benefits just by the accident of where you happen to be born. And it's true. I mean, the life chances of a person born on the Texas side as opposed to the Mexican side are, incredibly by orders of magnitude different, and that does seem sort of arbitrary and peculiar and weird. So I respect that scholarship very much. I don't personally agree with it. My own feeling about it is that the nation state, with all of its flaws and all of its problems, is probably better as a form of human organization than other things that would likely arise to replace it if we got rid of it. That is to say, I'd be worried about people would start organizing by religion or by race or by the sorts of things that they organized themselves by before the nation state arose roughly in the 17th century with the Peace of Westphalia, which I actually talk about a little bit in the book. Strangely enough, nobody highlighted that as the most interesting. The whole 17th century piece just got lost here. I don't know why. So for me, I think, to be intellectually honest, I have to say that if I don't believe in completely open borders, then at least the extended border control form of deportation is not presumptively illegitimate. I wouldn't say that a government shouldn't be able to do that, but I do think, as Don was saying, that we really need to bring a lot of the nuance of the rule of law and a lot of other factors into the calculus of whom should we deport. So criminal law is a good analogy. Should there be a statute of limitations for deportation? Should it be relevant if a person was recruited to come here? I mean, I think the answer to both of those questions is yes. Should there be some proportionality balancing, as there is, by the way, in all of Europe, in the European human rights system, that says, okay, you broke a law, you're not supposed to be here, but you have kids, you have a family, you've been working here. So we take that into account. That's part of the discretionary balancing. So you have a sense of graduated sanctions and so forth. So my model for that, for the extended border control, would be that. As far as the post-entry social control, personally I tend to think of that as double punishment. And I think that actually had the Supreme Court not gone the wrong way in the late 19th century, it would be recognized in U.S. law that way, that if you commit a crime, you do your time. Your immigration status is not relevant to that question. You should be punished in the criminal system. Why you should then also be deported after that, I don't understand the theory behind that. I have trouble understanding that. I think it's disconnected from the question of the border. I think it's cruel. And again, in much of the world, the government has a much heavier burden to show that a person really deserves that sanction, and it's often thought of as being a form of double punishment. So that's me, but I don't know if Don, if you want to weigh in on that.
Yeah, I'm not open all borders type of person. I basically think that there can be fixes in the law, and I think a lot of us have lived under the specter of the 1996 immigration law, which was kind of a disastrous law for 16 years now, and so restoring discretion in the law, allowing for case-by-case determinations that consider the equities in a person's situation, when they committed a crime, have they led a clean life since then, do they have family here, how long have they lived here, are they lawful permanent residents, all that stuff that you can't really take into account anymore in any significant way. All that needs to be restored so that deportation is a proportional punishment when it's necessary. I think, I think just the concept of sovereignty just needs to be reoriented. The way that people talk about it, I don't agree with it at all. It's not mostly or just about national security or controlling borders, but that's the way that it's talked about. And then I guess the third point is that whole strategy of deportation by attrition, making life unlivable for people and necessarily for their families too. I think that's a cruel strategy and it just should be abandoned.
Let me say one other thing. which I should have mentioned in response to your question, there's pretty much consensus, actually, among Democrats and Republicans, that we need to reform the labor system in this country to take account of the historical patterns and the current patterns of recruitment of non-citizen workers, especially in the Southwest. That was a part of the Bush plan. It had flaws, but that was a part of it. I think most people recognize that using deportation as a mechanism of labor market control is like that line, if the only tool you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. I mean, it's just not a nuanced system. And so I think there will be some reform. I'm actually cautiously optimistic about that. That's part of the irony of the DREAM Act and what the Obama administration did, and maybe we'll talk a little bit more about this. A lot of the immigrant activist organizations did not support particularly carving out this one group for the generous treatment that they've gotten, because it tends to take away the best, the most sympathetic examples. These are the best and the brightest among the immigrant youth. They're the ones who have done nothing wrong, who have lived perfect lives. And as a result, some of the political force for the others has been lost in terms of reforming the system. A similar thing happened in 1996, by the way, when business reform was separated out from deportation issues. But I'll stop there. That was a bigger question. I'm sorry. Did you want to comment about that?
I would just add one more thing. I think there needs to be a combination of discretion with absolute definitions of rights. I mean, we should never cross certain lines, and I think those lines are very blurry in immigration. Retroactivity would never be accepted in other settings, but it is in immigration. The kind of punishment fitting the crime, they seem to be very intuitively to go together, but not in immigration. So I think there's got to be some sense that immigrants, no matter how severe the immigration violation was, that there's certain absolute human rights that withstand that international community would just not accept, regardless of each national immigration laws. And I think that's the part that's been made just completely gray and just not dealt with. At the same time, part of the solution is discretion. So I think it's just balancing those two in a way so that it overall it has a fairness effect to it, and it also has a very practical sense of managing the immigration system so that it serves several different purposes. As opposed to trying to pretend that there is a perfect solution that's going to completely stop illegal immigration and somehow perfectly, make sure that no, crime is ever committed. So I think, it's kind of a combination thing. I think.
Any other questions? Yes.
Aren't we expecting an awful lot of trust from immigrants who have been subjected to record high levels of deportation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Even from the Obama administration, and I'm thinking two things. We all, I think, are glad that we have this deferred action, but some of my first clients have said, how do we know they won't go after our parents? And the second thing that the Obama administration did, which I think they thought was an improvement, and I'm not sure, is the revised waiver, the I-601A waiver.
Yeah.
And you can apply for the waiver in this country and then leave the country and go for consular processing. And if the consular processing doesn't work out, you are stranded.
Yeah. So there's two parts. I was asked to restate the question. So the question was, doesn't the current administration or we asking a lot of trust from non-citizens, because even the I don't even know what to call it. We call it the DACA or the sort of mini DREAM Act or the discretion thing, doesn't protect family members. It actually doesn't protect individuals beyond a 2-year period. And then you were talking about this idea, which is a complicated idea that we probably shouldn't get into the technicalities of, but that certain people who are able to regularize their immigration status have a particular problem and they need a waiver for having been out of status, and the administration says, well, you can file this waiver, but then you have to go abroad to have it adjudicated. So my answer is to the first, yeah, that's a terrible problem, and I've been consulted by clients as well, and I have a very hard time giving advice to people about this, because I say, you are taking a big chance. Now, Practically, Mitt Romney was the governor of Massachusetts. I know sort of what he's about. If I had to predict, I would not predict that even in a Romney administration they would go back on the promise, nor do I think could they legally, to the actual people who are applying and deport them. But in terms of the family members, it is the great danger that once you're in the database, they can use that information for a very long period of time. Let me just respond to the second thing, and then I'll, sorry, go ahead. Finish your...
What I was saying, in terms of Romney, one of the questions that I have been asked several times is, okay, if Obama is reelected, you probably can renew this, but what if he isn't?
Right.
And it's a matter of, I think, genuine concern.
No, but I'm saying that my guess is, and I don't know Mitt Romney personally, but I did live in Massachusetts when he was governor. I'm just saying if I had to predict with a client, and, you know, I mean, I predicted Walter Mondale was going to be president, so take my predictions with a grain of salt. I mean, I lost money on that. But if I had to predict, I would predict that the Romney administration will not deport the actual dreamers. But there are definitely people in ICE who are only too happy to have these large databases where you had a population who they couldn't catch. Now they've got them all in one place. That's a dangerous and risky situation. That's true.
How do we advise our clients who would like to take advantage of deferred action but don't want their mothers and fathers deported?
I don't have an answer to that. I mean, that's the dilemma of our time. You have to hope that there's going to be a more comprehensive solution or a reform of the system, but that is the real risk that they are running. There's no question about it. Whether you can fill out a form and decline to answer the question about family members, I'm not enough in the knuckles of it to, maybe somebody else has an opinion about that. I'm not sure. I will say about the waivers, it is different now. They have reformed it. I mean, it used to be you couldn't even apply for the waiver without going abroad, and then you had to file for it. So at least now you can file here. That's been a big change, and I think a really positive one. But that might be more technical than people want to get into. So maybe you want to get into it.
Well, I could get into it, but I don't think I want to. I mean, but what I did want to say is it's a good if you just back up from that for just a second, for people that aren't kind of immigration practitioners. You know, we looked at the numbers when I was at a previous job, and there's 3.5 million people that have been approved for visas. And are awaiting them. Most of them in the United States. It's not exactly known how many, but 3.5 million. Of that 10 million that are unauthorized have done everything that they were supposed to do, and because the laws don't work very well, and because there's this interplay between kind of the places that, caps on the places that people, visas for the places that people come from, and the kind of preference category by relationship, they're oftentimes waiting for these visas for which they've been approved for 10 years, 20 years, So when you talk about people getting in the back of the line and not wanting to get in the back of the line, these are people that have been in the line, and that's about a third of the unauthorized. And if you start to pick them off like that, it's, 4 million for mixed that with U.S. citizen children, and on and on and on. So it becomes a very different kind of looking population than the undifferentiated group of lawbreakers that you hear about. Right?
And even what's available now, I assume everybody knows this, but I should say it's a really narrow slice. You have to have been under 16 when you came. You have to be under 30 now. So you get contacted by somebody, like I've got clients like this who say, I came when I was 2 years old. And I say, well, how old are you now? And he says, 40. And I say, well, you can't apply. He's been here longer. But I mean, this is just an experiment. This was an attempt. Yeah, Lenny.
So this last year I did a study of the immigration courts, and it was really an honor in a way to represent the Administrative Conference of the United States and talk to judges and talk to ICE attorneys and talk to advocates over and over and over, talking with district counsel in ICE and with judges. You've heard the fear of discretion. So I know you've written in the past also about the beauty of discretion and its purpose. The same anecdotes were repeated
So I take a dim view of people killing a carload of nuns. Let me just say on the record, I'm opposed to that.
How do we, why is the culture, is the question, why is the culture of immigration on the government side, on the people responsible for using the 16 billion and enforcing the laws, so fearful of the exercise of discretion, in contrast with district attorneys and environmental law prosecutors and U.S. attorneys who deal with life and death situations as well?
Well, the short answer, I think, is because the right wing seized control of the public debate after the Oklahoma City bombing. And progressives had a difficult time articulating their position even before that, but it became especially difficult after that. And the tide has turned, and it's beginning to turn back now. But I think public debate has been very one-sided in this country, and particularly once everything became securitized after September 11th, everybody wants to err on the side of safety in all things. And this is an area that most people perceive as a pretty low-cost place to do it because it doesn't affect most citizens all that much. And you know, immigration status is at least on first blush, is a legitimate way to categorize people as compared to race, let's say, or gender. So the idea is that they're not full citizens, they don't have the same rights, and we should make the calculus err on the side of safety whenever it concerns them, is a pretty appealing argument. How do you counter that? I can give my talk again, but you know, you see it takes time. I mean, so you have on the one hand a very simple argument against risk, and on the other hand you have a more nuanced, historical, justice-based. I mean, Don and I say, you know, sovereignty needs to be a nuanced concept. You know, I mean, you're not going to get people chanting sovereignty needs to be a nuanced concept. But if some, you know, immigrant goes out drunk driving and kills somebody, everybody can say, well, if he hadn't been here in the first place, he wouldn't have killed anybody. That's simple. So it's tough. It's tricky. Sir.
One thing I've wondered for years, I've practiced studying the '96 Act, and I know the effect of it, and that's whether the legislators who enacted it, who signed off on it, really knew what the hell they were doing.
Great question.
Of course you know what they're doing, because they see it, but the congressmen on both sides of the aisle, but they possibly have understood the effect of that complex weapon legislation.
Here's what I say to my students. It's a one-word answer, and it rhymes with snow. There is now a lot of evidence that a lot of the people who signed that law in '96 had no idea. It was part of an omnibus measure. It was a huge law. I mean, people say that about health care, but you know, this was really that way. And in fact, there are people who voted for that law who then saw the consequences as to constituents in their district who have appealed for special waivers for some kid from Florida or something, you know, when the guy said, you know, I'm hard on this in general, but now I see what I did, I regret it. It's much easier to pass those laws, though, than it is to repeal them, because it's much easier to be politically successful by being tough on things than it is to be by being nuanced and sympathetic. So part of the history of immigration that's quite interesting in this country is that the laws are an agglomeration of things, you know, that go back hundreds of years, but the restrictionary aspects of them tend to stick, and the others are harder to remove. So again, the campaign for nuance and discretion is hard, but the campaign to, you know, deport drug dealers was pretty easy. Don, you know a lot more about this than
Well, I mean, you remember there was a worse House bill at the time, you know, and I remember it well because I spent a month just reading it, you know, and I know damn well that the legislators didn't spend a month reading it, but I did. I took a month off and did, and it was written by one guy, and it was a wish list of, you know, all the kind of enforcement things that anybody could think of over at, you know, over at INS at that time, but also on Capitol Hill, and that's what it was. It was 400 pages. And, you know, what did happen, Dan is exactly right. As soon as this happened, the bill passes, they're starting to deport people for crimes they committed, you know, 10 years ago that are relatively minor. I mean, some really sad cases. Fathers are getting deported. Their kids are committing suicide in, like, at least one case, you know. Minor drug possession crimes of, you know, 20 years back from kind of pillars of the community that are now lawful permanent residents start to get deported. And all of the people that sponsor it, including Congressman Lamar Smith, write a letter to the commissioner of INS and say, what is this? You guys aren't exercising prosecutorial discretion in these cases, right? I mean, these are the exact same people that are criticizing Obama on prosecutorial discretion and on deferred action for the Dreamers now. I mean, it's like a very, very rich irony. And of course they didn't know all of what was in it.
By the way, the wish list was circulating for a good period of time, and it was the Oklahoma City bombing that sort of gave the impetus. You may remember that in the immediate time after the bombing, there was this talk of swarthy foreigners that was actually on CNN who had been seen fleeing the scene, the swarthy foreigners. And this law responded to that. By the time Timothy McVeigh surfaced, the law had already gained enough momentum to go through. And, you know, Big Dog signed it. Bill Clinton signed it. I think he didn't think it was going to have the staying power that it did, but he did. Yes. We already asked a question, so.
You mentioned wrongful deportations. I wonder if you could talk about the pros and cons of that term. Because on the one hand, it's very much like the wrongful convictions. It's been very successful for the death penalty advocates. On the other hand, it focuses somewhat on the wrong determinations in the system rather than the wrongness of the system.
Yeah, that's a great. The question was, why do I use the term wrongful deportations? And part of it is that it's a shorthand, but it is, you're right, it's a euphemism, and it encompasses a lot of different things. I mean, I say in the book that there's a reason why the Innocence Project was not called the Disproportionality Project. You know, I mean, innocence has a certain bite to it that disproportionality, again, it's a more complicated argument. And when we talk about wrongful deportations, we actually include both the forensically wrongful, of which there are plenty. You know, that would be the analogy to the Innocence Project. I mean, we can't disprove it by DNA, but we can prove it in other ways. And some of those are U.S. citizens, so that's clearly a wrongful deportation. On the other hand, there's a lot of deportations that are disproportionately harsh, or somebody just needs a visa to visit their kids. Those are the ones that are more the comprehensive indictment of the system as a whole. All I can say is I struggled with that phraseology, but our project handles both, and we try to both reform the system and deal with this. I mean, actually, there's a similar issue in the criminal justice system. You could ask the same question. I mean, the Innocence Project has focused laser-like attention, tremendously positive, I think, on certain aspects of wrongful convictions. But what does it do about 3 strikes and you're outlaws, or other things in the system? So I think it's a good question, but we're trying. How much time, Lenny? Do we have a?
We have 10 minutes.
Okay. Well, how about this lady, and then I'll come back to you. Yes.
Yes, you've been talking a good deal about people who've committed small crimes. Do we have good statistics on people whose only offense was walking across the border, committed no crimes, but have been deported for that?
Yeah. Well, no. I mean, we have very good statistics about that. Those are the undocumented.
Right.
There are. Well, last year, I think the number of returns, if I remember correctly, was about 641,000. I see Julia Preston is here. She wrote a great article about this, quoting the report. Was that number? I think that was the number of.
You're talking about combined returns and removals?
No, just returns. Oh, it's 300 something thousand, right? And that's actually lower. I mean, the number of returns has been going down quite a lot, but it's still in the hundreds of thousands. If you went back a few years, you'd get numbers up around, I think it was as high as 700,000 maybe, just a couple of years ago. There are fewer people who are being caught close to the border right now. There are fewer people sort of streaming into the country right now. Most experts think that's more due to the economy than it is to immigration enforcement. But, yeah.
Aren't there a lot of people, though, who've been here for a long time who are deported?
Yes. Yes. I mean, they're still caught. But what I was saying before is that there's less of that. I mean, some of them are eligible for the relief we were just talking about, some of the young ones. But yeah, there's a lot of people in this country who have been here for long periods of time who lack status. And if they happen to get pulled over by a police officer in Massachusetts, which could be for any number of things, I had a client who was just pulled over because they had a little statuette of Jesus dangling from the rearview mirror, and the cop said that violated law and pulled him over, discovered they had no paper, and shipped him back to Guatemala. So, and in Arizona, I mean, people are getting pulled over for all kinds of things. So, yeah, yes, that's a big part of the system.
I mean, the statistic that I think about is 1.2 million have been here for 20 years or more of the unauthorized. So that's and then of the people that have been here for 10 years or more, I think it's almost 6 million. So, I mean, these are folks that have built lives here, built a lot of equities here.
And by the way, prior to 1996, just as an example, there used to be something that was called suspension of deportation, that people who had been here for 7 years, or in some cases 10 years, could apply for. A pure discretionary remedy. Show that it was a hardship, and you could ask a judge not to deport you under suspension of deportation. That was changed in 1996, so now you need to have a U.S. citizen relative in order to apply for it, and the standard keeps going up. It used to be you have to show that it would be a hardship. Then the Congress said now it has to be an extreme hardship. Now I think it's an extremely unusual hardship, exceptional hardship. I mean, it's like the mind boggles in the search for adjectives. You had another question, yes?
A question slash proposal. When I hear about the wish list for the 96 Act, I have for years at every AILA conference kibitzed with my colleagues and asked them, why don't we create a model immigration code? Not something that's politically possible, but something that we think in the realm of the ideal is at least a touchstone for legislators in the future. That would sort of have some of these due process procedure, an orderly labor market system depending upon demand, an exit-entrance strategy, favoring the talented, trying to make entry for the working poor. Fees right now are almost impossible, where the breadwinner is a cash earner and the mother is a U.S. citizen, making entry into the workforce and tax-paying system somewhat easier. So what I'm suggesting or asking is whether academia, in conjunction with activist groups and the organized bar, have begun or would begin to work on a model immigration act.
Well, I'm laughing as you say this because Don and I spent, I don't know how many years, on one Tuesday afternoon in Washington. We were part of the American Bar Association Immigration Commission that actually has come up with a number of these reports in terms of enforcement. We've done that. And Don has done more in terms of the rest of this. Maybe you want to talk about some of the MPI stuff. I mean, this stuff is out there and it has already been done. But your question, and you even talk about AILA, so you know that's the American Immigration Lawyers Association. But the fact that you haven't seen that stuff is a dagger in my heart. I think Don is probably feeling the same way. So do you want to talk about our great work product that apparently nobody knows about?
I'll just talk about how wounded I am.
Yeah.
No, there is a lot of, I mean, I don't know about a model code, but there's an awful lot of, commission reports, and the Council on Foreign Relations did one, and Brookings did one, and Migration Policy Institute. And there's like widespread agreement on kind of what ought to be in them, or a lot of overlap anyway, let's put it that way, a lot of overlap. So, I mean, I think that it's not an issue of the ideas aren't out there, they are out there. It's, there's not kind of the political will to, and, yeah, exactly.
And that's why we need to vote for Walter Mondale.
So I'm going to close the story with a small anecdote because we had a lot of fun tonight. We learned a lot, but I think for some of us it's like, oh, it's depressing because look at those numbers, look at that reality. And so years ago, I read this little story. There was a young boy on a beach, and the sun was very hot. And the starfish had come out in record numbers, and the tide had receded. The sun being very high, the water being very far away, starfish were dying at rapid increments all over the beach. And the little boy started running and picking up a starfish and throwing it into the water. An old man is standing back, that would be me, the old man standing back and saying, "Mashigana," Yiddish for crazy one. "You're not making any difference. The tide is out, the sun is hot, these starfish are going to die. What you're doing doesn't matter." And the little boy looked at the starfish in his hand and he said, "It matters to this one." So take the energy tonight, volunteer with the New York Immigration Coalition, go to a DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals training, work with Don Kerwin and the Center for Migration Studies, who has a conference coming up in Washington in October. You can read about it on their website. Buy Dan Canstrom's books so you get more articulate about making these arguments. And outside in the hall are not only Dan's books, but a brochure for the New York Law School Safe Passage Project, where you can volunteer to represent an immigrant child. So I want to thank everyone, James O'Malley for helping us do the reception, the Center for Migration Studies, New York Immigration Coalition, City Bar, New York Law School. Thank you, the audience.
Absolutely. Let me get a, do you have a pen? Let me get a pen.
The piece in Westphalia.
You want that?
QIS video, QIS video. I hope so. I don't know if we'll give me the last piece of Westphalia. It looks like a boy.